In 1953, a director cast himself as the lead in an exploitation film about a man who wore women's clothing, wrote himself lines he knew too well, and wore his own personal Angora sweater on camera. His producer had no idea any of it was personal. The whole thing started with Christine Jorgensen. In December 1952, Jorgensen became headline news as one of the first Americans to undergo gender reassignment surgery. A New York Daily News headline described her as a blonde former soldier. It was the most discussed story in the country. A producer named George Weiss saw those headlines and saw dollars. He hired a young, mostly unknown director named Edward D. Wood Jr. to make a cheap exploitation film riding the Jorgensen wave. The plan was simple. Spend almost nothing, release fast, and cash in. Wood told Weiss he was the perfect man for this project. That was technically true, and Weiss never thought to ask why. Wood had been wearing women's clothing since childhood. He had a particular fondness for Angora sweaters, and he had never told his producer any of that. Wood wrote the script himself. The story he wrote was not really about Christine Jorgensen. It was about a man named Glen who secretly wore women's clothes and feared losing the woman he loved if she ever found out. It was autobiography dressed up as exploitation. Then Wood cast himself as Glen. In the central dramatic scene, Glen's fiancée discovers his secret and responds not with disgust but with acceptance, handing him her Angora sweater as a gesture of love. Wood wrote that scene. Wood acted that scene. That is the scene he wanted to exist in the world. To fill the film out and give it some marquee value, Wood brought in Bela Lugosi. By 1953, Lugosi was 70, largely forgotten and struggling for steady work. Wood cast him as a mysterious scientist figure who delivers strange monologues about the universe and humanity. The character has nothing to do with the rest of the film. Lugosi's scenes feel like they were dropped in from a different dimension, which they basically were. Wood shot them separately and cut them in as a kind of cosmic framing device. Lugosi looks directly at camera and says things like, "Pull the string. Pull the string." Nobody in 1953 had any idea what to do with that. The film also includes a lengthy sequence that plays almost like a public service announcement, arguing that men who wear women's clothing are not criminals or predators, that they are ordinary people who deserve to be understood rather than prosecuted. In 1953 America, putting that argument on screen, even in an exploitation picture, was genuinely unusual. The Angora sweater appears throughout the film. It is not a prop. In real life, Wood owned and wore Angora sweaters. His fondness for them was well documented by people who knew him. When the camera lingers on the texture of the sweater, that is not a directorial choice made for dramatic effect. That is a man filming something he loves. The film was released under several different titles depending on the market. Some prints called it I Changed My Sex. Others called it He or She. Weiss sold it to regional distributors who marketed it as titillation. Audiences who expected something lurid got a confused, earnest, deeply personal film that did not know what genre it was. Reviews were bad. Audiences were baffled. The film disappeared into the grindhouse circuit and was largely forgotten. Wood kept making movies. He made Plan 9 from Outer Space. He made Bride of the Monster. He died in 1978, mostly unknown, largely broke. In 1980, Harry and Michael Medved published a book called The Golden Turkey Awards. It named Wood the worst director of all time and Plan 9 from Outer Space the worst film of all time. The book was meant as mockery. What it actually did was introduce a new generation to Ed Wood's films, including Glen or Glenda. Once people started watching Glen or Glenda knowing who Ed Wood actually was, the film read completely differently. The desperation in it, the sincerity, the scene with the sweater, the fiancée who accepts her partner without flinching, all of it landed differently when you understood the director had written himself a happy ending he may never have gotten in real life. Glen or Glenda was never renewed for copyright after its original release, which means it passed into the public domain. You can watch the full film today on the Internet Archive, exactly as it played in grindhouse theaters in 1953. Bela Lugosi and all. There are films that confuse you and films that move you. Glen or Glenda is somehow both at once, which is not a combination you expect from an exploitation shoot in 1953. If you want more films that turned out to be something completely different from what they looked like, the reelvault has a lot of those. Subscribe and we will keep finding them.